Hello, I'm Al Regnery. I'm the president of Republic Book Publishers, and we are proud to be publishing a book by Carter Wrenn, a longtime North Carolina political consultant, entitled The Trail of the Serpent. And this book is a lot of stories and anecdotes and things that have been garnered together over a lifetime of work in politics that I think sheds a lot of light on what's going on today. So I'm pleased to be here with Carter, and we're going to talk about the book and some of the things in it and how it relates to current politics and other issues that might come along. So, Carter, welcome, and it's good to be with you.
Thank you, Al. Go ahead.
Good. So, Carter, you've been involved in politics for a long time, back into the 60s and the 70s, I guess, and you've seen every conceivable kind of um, issue and problem and scandalous things and whatnot, I'm sure. And I just wondered if you could relate a little bit to what's going on today in politics, both in North Carolina and nationally, as you see it, and how it relates to some of those things that you've seen before and are written about in your book.
From the 70s to the present. And politics has changed a lot. And it used to be lies were taboo. Nixon in 72 won in a landslide. Got caught on tape telling a lie about Watergate and had to resign. That's how taboo lies were in the 70s. And if a politician told a lie, they paid a price. Today, that's gone. Today, people don't reject politicians who tell lies. And that's a decline in our politics. And it's part of what I call the trail of the serpent. And that's what I track by telling stories about different campaigns and how that develops. But that's one big change. Now, there's a lot of others, but I think that's very fundamental.
So, what brought about that change?
Well, I think that part of it has to do with religion, decline in culture, and part of it has to do with there are no threats. In the 70s and 80s, we were in the Cold War, and the generation of World War II veterans, when we lost the Vietnam War, they thought we're losing the Cold War. They saw a threat, and they didn't want to put up with phony politicians or deceitful politicians. They wanted real leaders. Once the Cold War ended, threats disappeared, and we started into a period of decline that gradually rolled over years. Another part of it is the spread of corruption in politics.
So, do you suppose that's meant that means that we have a worse class of people in politics than we did 30, 40 years ago? Certainly different.
I think, yeah, certainly different. And you could make the case for that. But I think that politicians don't so much shape or mold voters as they reflect their ethics, their views. And if voters were not willing to accept lies and insults, politicians would be afraid to do that. So I think part of the blame falls on the politicians, but a lot of it just falls on the voters.
How about the press? What do they have to do with it?
Press is part of the same problem. When I was young, I thought the press was liberal and biased and terrible. Today, I think it's worse. And I never thought I would have said that. When they started up the sort of the partisan press like Fox, CNN, and MSNBC, I thought that would be a step in the right direction because people would hear facts from a perspective, but facts. But instead, all those political networks, they're looking for viewers, and they get viewers by telling them what they want to hear. And so they don't say anything hardly critical of the candidates the viewers want to cheer for.
I guess that's true of the newspapers too, isn't it?
Much more so. But the newspapers have waned so much over the last decade. You know, we used to have a major paper in Raleigh that had a lot of political force. Well, they cut back their staff, they've lost their income. They're still there, but they don't have near as much clout as they once did. If you want to boil newspapers down, you're really looking at 3 or 4 major newspapers in the country, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Not a lot of press out there anymore, newspapers.
Okay, so in terms of where we're involved, obviously in a pretty vibrant political campaign right now, a presidential one. As you look at that, I'm sure you've watched these debates and so on. Assuming you were advising these candidates, what would you be telling them?
There are 3 tribes of voters out there right now. You have the Republicans, and 85–90% of the Republicans are going to vote for the Republican candidate. And the Democrats, 90% of them are going to vote for the Democrat. But then you've got this huge group of swing voters. They don't like either party. They're not aligned with either party. And they're pretty much fed up with politics. I think what you have to do to appeal to them is show that you're not a politician. I thought the debate with Vance and Walz, you know, at the end of that, they were courteous. There was decorum. There was politeness. They argued. They disagreed. But they didn't do it by hurling insults or posturing. And when that was ending, I thought, I wish those 2 guys were running against each other for president. And if you turned on TV afterwards to watch the commentators, I saw Democrat and Republican commentators saying the same thing. The decorum was so different. And that has a lot of appeal to swing voters who are fed up with all the howling and posturing and insult hurling they see in politics these days.
So do you suppose they did that because they were advised to do so by their handlers, or was this something that came naturally?
You know, there's no way to answer that question. I don't know if it was just their nature or if, you know, one of them started down that road and the other one decided, well, I'll go down the same road, or if their advisors told them, don't go into the lies and the insult hurling. But I think Democrats are very smart about campaigns these days. Used to be in the 70s and 80s, Republicans had an edge in terms of how to do campaigns. That leveled out. Right now, I think Democrats run much more effective campaigns, so they might perceive that. The Republicans, with Trump leading the Republican tribe, it's hard to see them saying, well, don't insult people.
So in North Carolina, you've got a very interesting governor's race going on between a black, very conservative Republican and a sort of an elitist Democrat attorney general, Harvard, Yale, and all those things. The Republican, I guess, never probably went to college at all. They are they're poles apart, and I guess it's a fairly interesting race. Can you talk about that from the perspective of some of the things you'd seen before and how it's different from maybe other North Carolina governor's races you've seen?
Well, it's certainly different from any governor's race we've seen. You know, years ago when Jesse Helms ran the 3rd time, we set out to make the campaign about issues, liberal versus conservative, and it didn't work. Didn't move any votes. Hunt was very popular, and it just didn't move votes. Jesse was fairly unpopular. And our pollster came in after a year, and he put a poll on the table, and he looked at me, and Tom Ellis, who was chairman of Helms's campaign, said, you've got to learn something new. This campaign isn't about issues, it's about character. And you don't see many character elections, or didn't back then. I think what's happened this year is in our governor's race, it's a character election. Usually you think he's got my stand. I agree with him on the issues I'm going to vote for. Well, people look at Josh Stein. He's an old-fashioned liberal, but he's nice. He's soft-spoken, calm. You can disagree with him, but still like him. Mark Robinson, he's boisterous. He's got a mean streak. He talks mean. And when you see him, your reaction is, well, even if I agree with him, I don't like him. That's what gives us a character election. And I think that's what's deciding people's votes rather than whether they agree with Stein or Robinson on an issue. That was a long answer.
So in your book, recount a story or two that you tell in the book that would shed some light on this character issue. I mean, you mentioned the Jesse Helms one. Of course, Jesse was the very conservative member of the Senate for many years. But were there other people that you worked with that demonstrated all of that?
That was you didn't see a lot of character campaigns back then. When Reagan ran, it was all about issues. It was about winning the Cold War, détente or military superiority. But when Helms ran in '84, we had a character campaign. And what helped him come from 25 points behind was his opponent had flip-flopped on a lot of issues. And when we pointed out the flip-flops and gave examples of them, that helped turn the election around. The second thing is that Washington has become more corrupt today. And, I had a friend who was elected to Congress 10 years ago. And he had been a prosecutor. He prosecuted corrupt politicians. And the first time he went to Washington for a meeting, he came home that night and he sat down in my office and he said, I sat in this room full of Republican congressmen, and the walls were lined with charts with every congressman's name on it. Next to each name, there was a dollar amount. And I sat there wondering what that's about. He said, well, I found out if you wanted to be appointed to the Ways and Means Committee, you had to raise $500,000, put it in there in the Republican leader's campaign fund. If you wanted to be on the Foreign Relations Committee, you had to raise $250,000. Every appointment came with a price, and if you didn't pony up, you got put on the Parks and Recreations Committee. And I said, well, I don't understand why Democrats haven't attacked Republicans for that. And he laughed and he said, they can't. They do the same thing. That's an example of the growth of corruption in politics over the years. And that money they raise comes from lobbyists. And that's led to a lot of disgust with Washington and politics generally. And I think that had a lot to do with Trump's first campaign. When you looked at the debate stage in the primary in 2016, I remember the first debate, there was like 10 candidates, and 9 of them talked and sounded like Washington politicians. The only one that didn't was Trump, and I think that broke him out, and that was why he won the primary.
So speaking of Trump, Carter, if you were hired by him today to give some advice for the rest of the campaign, what would you tell him? And let's just assume that he's going to listen to you.
I think that that's a difficult problem, because when you're in a campaign, the candidate's character, who he is, you can't create a false image of him. Sooner or later, the truth's going to come out. And I think Trump is who he is. And I think if you said you've got to change that, it won't work. It's just, you can't change a candidate's character. I'd urge him to be more careful about what he says, because a lot of times it's like something pops into his brain, like the Haitians eating cats. He hears it, pops into his brain, assumes it's true. And then you get the Republican governor in Ohio, he's a very credible figure, saying that was wrong. So I'd urge him to be more careful. But on the other hand, you can't really wave a wand and change a whole campaign because it's usually dependent on the candidate.
So let's go back to the book for a minute, Carter, The Trail of the Serpent. Why did you write it?
Back during COVID, I had a friend in New York who was locked down up there. And he used to love to call and we talk about politics. And I'd tell him stories. You know, I didn't lecture him or didn't act like a history professor. I would just tell him stories. And finally he said, you know, you got to write all that into a book and do a memoir. And back then, with everything locked down, there was plenty of time. There wasn't a lot going on. So I started working on it. And I started with the Reagan campaign and put a lot of emphasis on that. And then he said, well, you need to tell stories from Helms campaigns and Steve Forbes's campaigns and other campaigns you were in. And so I just kept telling stories until it all got in there.
Well, I must say there's some great stories in there. Anybody that's interested in politics would be fascinated hearing many of these stories, excuse me, from the person that was there in the room. Carter, the millions of dollars is spent these days every day on television ads.
Yeah.
For candidates. I mean, tens of millions of dollars, I guess. Are those effective? And can you talk about, just from your perspective over the last 30 or 40 years, how that has changed campaigns?
I'll tell you a story. When Jesse Helms ran for re-election in 1978, back then, what everybody did was they recruited volunteers, precinct chairmen, committees. You built a sort of a pyramid infrastructure to turn out vote. And we spent, over the first year of that campaign, $4 million doing that, which is probably like 20 million today. And then 4 months before the Democratic primary, our pollster said, you know, they're all going to be running TV ads. And we need to be on TV too, just, you know, sort of be sure we stay present in the race as they are. Now, when we did all that grassroots organizing, we went up 4 points for $4 million. We spent $250,000 on TV ads. We went up 10 points. And at that point, the TV age began for us. The next campaign we were in, we didn't spend much on grassroots at all. We spent a ton on TV. And that was very dominant for years. It still is. An exception is presidential races. If you're in a presidential race, there is so much media and publicity that ads, they matter, but they make less difference. If you're running for Senate or governor in a state, people don't get as much news, so ads do have a ton of impact. And of course, there's ways to do advertising now that didn't exist before, but they're really effective. And I'll give you 2 examples in that governor's race we talked about. Most political ads today, especially ads attacking your opponent, they fall into a mode. They're flashy graphics, dramatic music, a rough announcer's voice. And people have seen so many of those sort of ads, when as soon as one comes on 5 seconds into it, they tune it out. It doesn't matter anymore. They think that's just another political ad. I'm not going to pay any attention. Josh Stein, the Democrat running against Mark Robinson, the first political ad he did attacking Robinson, nothing in it but Mark Robinson making speeches. And he took clips from 4 Robinson speeches, and that was it, back to back. And it was not a political ad. It was not your standard political ad. I guess it was political, but it was believable because it was just him talking. And the second ad he did the same thing. He showed clips from Robinson making speeches saying, I own an AK-47 because the government gets too big for its britches. I'm going to put some lead in the back of them britches. And it's time to go to war, folks, and take your enemy's head. Well, it was just him speaking. And if you were watching that, even if you agreed with Robinson, you didn't like him. So that was an effective ad. So I think that advertising, it's how you talk to voters. It's still the most effective thing in politics. But you have to get away from the political genre of your standard political ads if you won't have any hope people will listen to you.
So how about negative campaigning versus positive campaigning? I'm sure you've seen many, many instances of both. And I guess they both work or people wouldn't do them and spend the money on them. Can you comment about how effective they are? Maybe tell us a story or two about a negative or a positive campaign issue that worked or didn't?
Back in the 70s, very few people ran negative TV ads. It was sort of a customary belief that putting a negative ad on TV would backfire. And in 1980, when Reagan ran, we had a Senate candidate here. We did a negative TV ad. We were pretty uneasy about it. We thought it might backfire, but it didn't. And what you need to do in a campaign, you've got to tell them about yourself and why to vote for you. But you also got to give them reasons not to vote for your opponent. You got to draw lines on the differences. And how you do it matters a lot, but negative TV ads are very effective. Now, I'll give you an example of how they can fail. In 1990, when Helms ran the fourth time, we took a poll, and there was a tax increase that Jesse's opponent has supported. 80% of the people opposed it, so we did an ad about it. And we took another poll, and it didn't move a single vote. And we had the pollsters and consultants in the room, and I said, okay, explain to me how we do an ad that 80% of the people disagree with GAN on, and it doesn't affect it. And Dick Morris was one of the people in the room, and he said, you've been running that same type of negative ad for 10 years. You've spent $100 million on them. People have seen hundreds of them. They don't believe them anymore. One comes on, they tune it out. He said, just do a very simple comparison ad. Here's the issue. Here's where Jesse stands. Here's where Harvey Gantt stands. That's your choice. We did that type of ad, took a poll, Jesse went up. So the way you convey your message makes a difference.
Anything else that you want to bring up from the book? Any other stories that you want to recount quickly before we end this?
Yes. In politics, people that work in campaigns, people that are running, they think they have a lot of power. They think they hold a power in their hands to win their elections. They tell themselves, what I'm doing is working, I'm winning this election. But the truth is, they're like a frog on a log rolling down a river, watching the banks roll by, telling themselves, I've really got this log rolling, but it's not them, it's the river. What elected Reagan the first time? When we lost the Vietnam War, World War II veterans who lived through World War II, fought in World War II, they watched Soviet tanks rolling into Saigon and fear-struck. They thought we're losing the Cold War. That created a river of people that elected Reagan. It wasn't that the politicians were smart enough to do that on their own. That river of people wanted somebody who thought would win the Cold War. That was what elected Reagan. And the second thing, in politics, the unexpected always happens. Reagan lost the first 5 primaries. One North Carolina that turned his campaign around. But when we got to the Republican convention, Ford had a small lead in the delegates, and Ford won. And we thought, well, that's it. It's over. And didn't think Reagan would be able to run again. Well, the last night of the convention, we were sitting there, and Alex Castellanos was with me. We and I worked together then, and he said, "You think Reagan can run in 4 years?" I said, "No, I don't think so." That night, Ford, when he made his acceptance speech, Reagan was sitting in a skybox, and he waved to Reagan to come down onto the stage. Ford was there, Rockefeller was there, Dole was there. And Reagan shook his head and said, "No, I pass." And he waved, friendly wave. Ford asked him to come down again. People started chatting, "Come down, come down." I didn't want him to, but finally he did. And when he got to the stage, people started chanting, "Speech, speech." None of this is planned. This is just happening. Ford points to the microphone. Reagan steps up and he gives a speech. It's a 30-minute speech. That speech turned his whole career around and put him on a straight road to the White House in 4 years. When I was leaving the convention hall, there was a Ford delegate, a lady, standing in the aisle crying, and she looked at me and she said, "We picked the wrong man." That's a completely unexpected thing that happened that changed politics. That's really the forces in politics are not the people in politics or the consultants or the candidates even. It's rivers and unexpected events.
You know, Carter, I'll tell you another part of that story. Somebody else told me that was sitting in the box with Reagan up there in the rafters of the convention hall that when Ford asked him to come down, he got up and he said, "I suppose they're going to want me to say something, and I just don't know what to say." Mike Deaver was saying, he says, "Oh, you'll think of something."
Yeah.
And he did.
He resisted it for a while, and then he finally did it, and it was
That was the first speech of the 1980 campaign.
yeah, nobody had anticipated that. But
well, those are the kind of stories that Carter tells so well in this book, and I think anybody who likes politics, or even people who don't like politics, would be fascinated by some of these stories that are just the way they happened. I mean, there's nothing that is embellished or withheld in it, just a lot of good stories about politics that sort of warms your heart about the system that we have with all the flaws. So I hope people will buy the book and will enjoy Carter's story. So thank you very much for this time, Carter, and onward.
thank you.